2020. The US, having lost one of their Amtraks, took a reaction. Fortunately, most of the team is now swimming to the shore, but extremely vulnerable. The second Amtrak has pushed through into the edge of the village, and we see the rest of the second platoon with their Amtrak now returning back for the second half of the platoon, having lost one Amtrak earlier, preparing to assault the Japanese 70mm regimental guns. In the centre, the US are massing in preparation to assault the cross, whilst the AOP is preparing to lay down fire on the enemy mortar platoon, and the US Corsair is going for a rocket attack. The Buck Rogers have been exposed by their smoke trail, failing a skill test, and they're going to be picking up some incoming artillery fire. The mortars come under attack from the heavy cruiser offshore, spotted by the AOP, and the Corsair rocket attacks the anti-tank guns, however not with much success. They're dug in and gone to ground, and so no casualties there. However, back across the river, the fight still continues on. The Japanese returned fire onto the Buck Rogers. Soft skin didn't go well for them. 105s destroying 2 out of the 3, effectively knocking out that platoon. A very interesting point, whilst they are cheap, very effective rocket launchers, the issue of the smoke trail leaves them extremely vulnerable, even if not in line of sight. The anti-tank duel is not going well for the Americans. They're now down to 1 anti-tank gun. However, they've also taken some light incoming fire on the platoon. So it's really all pushing back on the Americans now. That said, the heavy cruiser knocks out one of the mortars, and that's going to push them back. Fate layered by the Americans. Their own mortar platoon are now out of range and are doubling up to the village. You see them here now pushing towards the bridge, but they've still got a long way to go before they're going to be able to come into effective fire. They've only got a range of some 40 inches. Battle deck card is played, turn 4. This is great for the Americans as the heavy armour now comes into play, and this is going to be really, really difficult for the Japanese because they're almost impossible for them. So we join the action in round 21. You see the Americans here working their way up the river, screened by the heavy foliage. They're going to try and outflank the Japanese position, assuming that this heavy platoon is not unsupported. The Americans here assaulting the regimental battery, and that's not going to go well, I guess, for the Japanese. Here in the centre, they're going to have to probably bug out as they're taking heavy fire from the cruisers offshore, and with a +1 being dug in is not having much effect. The AOP guaranteeing eyes on for the heavy cruiser. In the centre, the Americans have tried to bounce the obstacle and risking, as they push across with no infantry support, attacks from the anti-tank guns. That said, they've still got the Corsair, and she's going to go another bombing run. Further back, the Americans have got problems of their own. They've lost their mortar platoon temporarily because she's out of range, and they've effectively launched the Buck Rogers platoon, soft skin, very, very vulnerable to heavy artillery fire. So it's going to be very interesting how the Americans are going to effectively get across this river, assault the main defensive position with most of their indirect fire support gone. They're going to rely heavily on their Corsair and their heavy cruiser battery, which is obviously off board. So we rejoin the action. The American platoon continues to push up the riverbank and to the edge of the village. They're about to take a skill test to see if they can spot this enemy OP position on the other side of the bush. Meanwhile, the melee continues. The Americans pushed in, didn't take any defensive fire, got into the melee, destroying one of the guns. The morale for the Japanese held, and they've counter-attacked with a sword unit, which has killed one of the American units. The problem the Americans have got is they've only got half the platoon across the river, because the other half is currently being ferried across, having lost one of their Amtraks, and this is causing them a real problem because they just cannot get the weight of numbers. However, here in the centre, the heavy cruiser firing indirect fire has pushed the mortars off, and that's reducing the indirect fire support from the Japanese. On the American left flank, the heavy armour now starts to push up. The mortar platoon, which was caught out by being left far back and out of range, is now close to getting into range, and the remaining Buck Rogers has relocated to avoid any more counter-battery fire. However, the Americans had a bit of a problem in the centre. They tried to bounce the obstacle, they failed an initiative test, a reaction test, failed to hit anything, and now they're all sitting exposed on the bridge to indirect fire and direct fire from the anti-tank guns, which can clearly see them on the bridge. The only saving grace they might have is, can the American Corsair do anything? He's got options: guns, napalm and bombs. Having expended his rockets, it'll be interesting to see which option he goes for as he tries to knock out these anti-tank guns.
Roger, buddy. Give me another smoke. We got Cobras on station.
Right, lead, come up. Alpha 3, this is Tango Echo. They've ordered up some Batmen for you, and if you need them, there's 3 King Bees at Charlie November's location at your disposal. How copy?
Do you understand?
Roger, this is Panzer.
So as we get into round 22, it's been everything to play for. The Americans winning the assault, destroying the 70mm regimental guns, even after the Japanese sword attack. They now hold the village with 2 platoons minus. They also managed to get rid of the OP position on the right flank. However, there still remains a Japanese OP position which is going to be falling back towards the reserve river position. In the centre, the Japanese mortars continue to flee. Here on the American left flank, Japanese right, a combination of combined arms from the AOP calling in the heavy cruiser, which had devastating effect on the anti-tank battery, supported by the Corsair firing its guns, has wiped out the platoon. Very fortunate for the US stewards that tried to bounce a bridge. However, the Americans didn't get it all their own way. The Japanese artillery observer for the 105s effectively took a reaction test, called in fire on his own position, and whilst it destroyed the obstacle, it actually has created a new obstacle, knocking out the lead M3. By pure chance, God knows what it was, but he managed to survive, taking a skill test and a reaction test, somewhat dazed, having called a battery of 105s on top of himself. So as we enter what will be round 22, it's really all to play for. The Americans now holding the bank. However, their position is not strong because they've been unable to secure an avenue across the river. However, the Japanese right flank and anti-tank guns have been wiped out. This is now going to pave the way for the US infantry, supported by heavy armour and some indirect fire support from the mortars, and remembering they do still have their air support.